It's a pleasure to introduce Thomas Pellerin Carlin. We share the same first name. That's, in my opinion, always a good sign. He's a director for EU programs for the Institute for Climate Economics in Paris. He used to work for the Jacques Delors Institute. That's where we met for the first time. And he has been speaking at this, let me say, prestigious event, maybe next time, 5 years ago. So he's a repetitive guest, but that's because he's so good. He has very, very solid insight into policy and politics, into energy policy and energy politics in the European context, maybe now with a bit more focus on France. But I think what we see at the moment is that national politics is actually poisonous for the European ambition level, not least after Macron announced that they will dump the boiler ban or the minimum requirements for boilers in fear of having the same reaction and the same confusion that the German Liberal Democrats created and really put, in my opinion, quite some harm to the energy transition. Thomas, please.
Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and as Thomas said, I was here 5 years ago to talk about the recent past and the future, and that's what I'm also going to do today. I want to first take a look back at what was achieved during this mandate of the European Commission and the European Parliament, and then look forward, look at the politics and the policies that can shape a different future for Europe in the next 5 years. The reason why I'm also here today is because I lead the program at the Institute for Climate Economics. We are what the Parisians call the think tank, well, the French actually call the laboratoire d'idées, which is a much nicer term, a thinking lab, if you want, where we have 40 experts, where we look at the economic challenges that Europe faces in order to transition to climate neutrality while also adapting to climate change. If we take first a look at what happened over the last 4 years in terms of public policies. To me, the biggest surprise, the most shocking and fascinating policy that was adopted over the last 4 years is the single biggest fossil fuel subsidy campaign in European history. For years and years and years and years, our politicians told us that they wanted to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. We have European Parliament resolutions endorsing that. We've got, now quite ironic, G7, G8, and G20 conclusions about it. And yet, when gas prices and then petrol prices started to increase in Europe from 2021 onwards, they reacted by introducing massive public subsidies for fossil fuel. If you take into account what the French, the Germans, the Czechs, the Spanish, the Swedish national fossil fuel subsidies were, and you do the sum, you reach, according to the estimate by a fellow think tank called Bruegel, an estimate of 600 billion euros spent in fossil fuel subsidies in Europe over the last 2 to 3 years. I'll let you do the math. How many millions of Europeans could have had an heat pump installed for free with that amount of money? And how much cheaper wind power and heat pumps would be if we had invested that money into more efficient manufacturing to achieve economies of scale. The second major new public policy also relates to the price of energy. And it's quite a paradoxical one, actually, arguably one that goes against that national fossil fuel subsidy. It's an EU-level carbon pricing revolution. Can you raise your arm if you're familiar with the ETS2, that acronym? Kind of, okay. For certain, each and every one of you will be super familiar with that term quite soon. From 2027 onwards, the EU will have a single European carbon market price for the entirety of the road transport and building sector. Meaning that the price of gas heating and oil heating for both households and service buildings will be increased by a factor that we don't know yet because it's a market price. It could be 10 euros per ton of CO2, just like it could be 100 euros per ton of CO2. So you see that contradiction in a way. We spend a ton of public money now to subsidize fossil fuels, and at the same time we create a carbon pricing to increase the cost of fossil fuel from 2027 onwards. A third policy, or rather lack thereof, are all the uncertain regulations that Thomas just mentioned on fossil fuel heating systems. I live in France. I was told by my government that gas boilers and oil heating boilers would be phased out very soon. And I just discovered a few days ago that actually, no, maybe not. And that kind of uncertainty, obviously, is not great if you want policies to send a clear signal to market players, to investors. The fourth element was a regulatory push to speed up solar and wind production in Europe, which is obviously great news because hopefully, and we know that for a fact, the more we invest in wind power and solar power, the cheaper the electricity becomes in Europe, especially if you can use that electricity in a flexible manner. And obviously, alongside battery electric vehicles, heat pumps are a great tool in order to consume electricity at a specific moment in a day when that electricity is cheap. The fifth element, the fifth new major public policy was a short-term public investment plan in the context of the green recovery of the economy after COVID or during COVID. And that's useful, but that's short-term. It's only looking at from now to 2026. And just think of it for a second. EU public money will fade away in 2026, just when the carbon price starts biting. And it's going to be quite rocky politically. Because in 2027, unless there is a change, unless there is an EU long-term climate investment plan, we will have a much stronger EU stick, the carbon price, with a much smaller EU carrot. Not politically always a recipe for success. And finally, by contrast, outside Europe, we have the US Inflation Reduction Act. And here, again, my fellow Europeans, let's overcome the state of denial. The Inflation Reduction Act is a long-term, quality climate investment plan in the USA, and it is at scale. It's not the number of $369 billion that many politicians have talked about. All the independent estimates estimate that the full cost of the Inflation Reduction Act will be between $800 and $1,200 billion. Here also, I'll let you do the math, how many pumps you could install with 1,200 billion US dollars. So that's for the policies. Now let's look at the politics. I chose to entitle that small talk, that small keynote, Writing the Next Chapter. And if you like books, reading them or writing them, you know that a book is first and foremost a good story, a good narrative. In 2019, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, wanted to be elected, and she came up with, frankly, a quite good narrative. Yes, we need to act for climate, and we will do so while creating jobs, and we will do so while creating what she called Europe's new growth model. And this narrative was unchallenged politically, apart from a few fringe groups. But the mainstream view in Brussels was, yes, we all agree with that narrative of the European Green Deal. And in 2020, when COVID hit, we doubled down, saying, yes, we're going to recover from COVID, but we're not going to build back the same economy. We're going to build it back better. And we're going to use green money in order to green the economy and further the Green Deal. RepowerEU was also along that line. Inside RepowerEU, there is more money, more regulations that support renewable energy and also heat pumps. But this changed in 2023 when this narrative started to be under attack in Brussels by specific politicians, mostly German Christian Democrats. One of them who wrote in a resolution in the parliament, a resolution that failed to pass, but still it gives us an idea on his view. And he said, and here I'm quoting, actually I learned it by heart now, that the European Union should, quote, take into account the fact that the Green Deal failed to deliver a business case for industrial transformation. That's what he says. And as a researcher, I was surprised because, the Green Deal in 2023 is just words. Huh? The regulations have not been enacted yet. The carbon pricing has not been enacted yet. The challenge also for you as a sector will be to prove him wrong. To prove that at least when it comes to heat pump, the Green Deal and other policies actually did create a successful business case for industrial transformation, for the transformation of your industry, but also your support in transforming other economic sectors. And this narrative is under attack in Brussels, but not when we look at what citizens think. And the way we look and study the way citizens think, one of those tools is obviously polling. And we have the Eurobarometer. And the Eurobarometer always asks, ahead of the European elections, the next one in 8 to 9 months, ahead of the European elections, what do you think should be the priority action of the European Union? And in the top 3, the answer, action against climate change. So the first one is fight against poverty, public health, and third one is action against climate change. That's much higher than, say, migration, that is over there, or agricultural policy, that is over there. So there is still a consistent demand from EU citizens for the EU to act on climate. The question is, what can we do? How can politicians start thinking about a new way, a revived way, to answer that demand from citizens? Because if the EU does not answer citizen concerns, then the EU will disappear as a political project. So, one way to do that would be to say, to double down on the narrative of von der Leyen and add maybe a new word, factories. It's not only about doing a Green Deal that is a new growth model, it's also a new industrial model with new factories, new jobs, and global leadership. And here, heat pump could be, in my view, one of the heroes of that new chapter of the Green Deal. Why? Because we have this International Energy Agency study that was released just this week. And it looks at areas where, so that's the manufacturing capacity of different clean techs. What you have here is the current one, and then it's the pipeline of projects. There are only only one sector when the EU is very likely to lead and be not second to the US or second to China, but number 1. It's heat pumps. And so that's just looking at the project pipeline. So if we continue all the good efforts that is currently being made in the heat pump sector in Europe, we will have a clear case of Europe not only being second to China, I mean, as someone who likes sport, I never like to come second, but someone who is first. And to have a clear case where decisive European action leads us to be number 1 in the world. So for my conclusion, I think we need to start thinking about that next chapter of the Green Deal. In that next chapter, we can use elements from the current chapter. The need for climate action has never been so important and also so supported by citizens. We also know that the economic narrative is right. We know that renewables, heat pumps, energy renovation do create jobs. And we also know that this is good for energy security, a concern that was there in 2019, but that is obviously much more acute now. And after the beginning of the second invasion attempt by Vladimir Putin on Ukraine, I was at Sciences Po Dijon, and I was with a friend of mine who is a Czech, and he does not really care about climate. Like, it's not his main concern. And we were like 6 weeks after the battle tanks started to move towards Kyiv. And I was talking to the students, he's a professor, and then I showed that picture. And I said, there are a lot of good reasons to buy a heat pump. And one of those good reasons is that you will annoy Putin. And I discovered recently that that Czech friend actually did buy a heat pump, first and foremost, because he really liked the idea that he could directly annoy Vladimir Putin. In a good story, in a good book, you need to have a good villain. And Putin has been giving us a lot to justify his position as the #1 villain in our story. So what we need? Do we need more carbon pricing? Yeah, maybe, maybe not. It's going to be politically difficult. Do we need more regulation? Absolutely. Politically difficult it is, we know, in France, in the UK, in Germany, but also at the EU level. Do we need more public finance in Europe to support that transformation? Yes. The question now is, how can you, as a sector, provide recommendations on where to put that money and where to do that most efficiently? Because public money is not here in unlimited amount unless you want to subsidize fossil fuels. But if you want to support actually good things, you always have the efficiency argument that comes into play. So we need an EU long-term investment plan to do several things. First, even if it's not the most urgent, is to prepare for the next stage, to prepare to speed up innovation, to prepare the next generation of heat pump for industrial heat, for instance, or heat pumps that are simpler to install. That's also a form of innovation we need to speed up. We need to scale up manufacturing projects and avoid a national subsidy race. As Europeans, we want heat pump factory to be placed in the area where they will be the most cost competitive, not in the area where we happen to have one government that is ready to give 10 billion euros for a single factory. Third, we need acceptability. One thing that an EU long-term climate investment plan could do is to have a program on heat pumps for the middle class. Heat pumps for the middle class does not need to mean subsidy. It can be loans, it can be guarantees, stuff that actually help people who have some means of investing in profitable investment like heat pumps. We also need to do this to mitigate popular backlash against ETS2, because in 2027, we don't know how hurtful that carbon price is going to be. We also need to support implementation. And I'm going to end on that, because when I'm in Brussels, people say, well, you know, Thomas, the Green Deal, that's so passé, and now it's just about implementation, implementation, implementation. And I'm like, yeah, try to win an election on that. You can't. But if you want to be elected, you have implementation, of course, because that's what we need also, but you also have a climate investment plan that gives you two things. First, it gives you a way to convince some member states to accept money to do reform. And finally, it gives you something that could be a successful electoral strategy for the elections in June. So I will end with a question to you guys for the rest of half a day that you have now. What could the heat pump component of an EU long-term climate investment plan look like? We need you now, and we need you to come up with efficient proposals now that can feed the political thinking that politicians are going to have. So hopefully, during the month before the elections, we have a serious debate on how we in Europe can invest in the future we want. Thank you.